think that's us. Right, Massimo, I'll get it started. Welcome to the Scotland Stoics. It was a great pleasure to get you on board. When we asked you, you were quite accommodating in coming on, and I know it's a wee bit of a difference of a time scale over here. Come back to New York, we're 7 p.m. over here, and you're 2. So thanks for coming on, and we'll start with a few questions. We'll do it a wee bit different tonight, Massimo. It's what we're intending to do is to get to know you a little bit better before we get into the theory of Stoicism and the philosophy as we know in that. So I found it interesting when I was looking through your Wikipedia. maybe not the best for information, but I'll start off with the first question. I seen that you were born in Liberia. Can you give us a wee background as to how that was the case? Because obviously I know you being Italian. How did being born in Liberia come about?
Right. That was because my father left Rome when he was fairly young, immediately after high school, to go work for a British company, as it turns out, essentially helping building roads, supervising the building of roads throughout several countries in Africa. He was in Kenya, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and then eventually in Liberia. And during one of his trips back to Rome, he met my mother. They fell in love, and my mother followed him to Liberia. So I was born in Monrovia. But but they decided that was not the place at the time to raise a kid. So a few months after I was born, they went back to Rome. So I grew up in Rome. But it's kind of unusual sort of background, from that perspective.
That would kind of leads on to the next question. Obviously, Rome being Rome, it's a place that many people would love to go and visit. How was it? What was it like growing up in Rome? What was it like? Obviously, the culture and that and so forth.
It's sometimes we were talking about just before we started that sometimes you kind of take for granted things, especially in the place where you live. And in my case, I was lucky enough that my parents divorced. As it turns out, and normally that's not a lucky thing, but in this particular case it was, because I grew up with my grandmother and my adoptive grandfather, and my adoptive grandfather had a thing for culture in general and for Roman history in particular. And so when I was a kid, it would bring me around to see, one of the very first things that I saw, for instance, when I was very young, was Marcus Aurelius' column right in the middle of Rome. Because it turns out that the major bookstore in Rome was situated right there, and my grandfather would bring me there to pick a book every few weeks and of whatever I preferred. And then we had one of his favorite cafes that we would sit down and for a break, and that cafe was right in front of the Marcus Aurelius column. So this whole thing, growing up with my grandfather was actually probably led me to appreciate Rome far more than a lot of Italian kids who just take for granted. I mean, like one of my younger brothers, he went to the Colosseum the first time as an adult because I brought him there. So it's like, but it is a cosmopolitan city. It is obviously an ancient city in terms of history. So you can't avoid, sort of soaking up that kind of atmosphere, especially when you become a teenager, late teenager, or early in your early 20s. Then you start going around on your own and exploring the city on your own or your friends. So it definitely was an interesting experience. But I take not that different from what it is like to grow in other major European cities, Paris, London, Edinburgh, places like that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that's excellent, Massimo. How was your early schooling growing up in Rome? Because I see obviously we're going to lead on to some of your education and how you've excelled in that, but how was your early schooling? How did you go on with school in that? Did you do well early, or did you have to be kind of prompted to kind of become more academically inclined?
So public schools in Italy, which are of course actual public schools, they're not private. Public schools in Italy are actually pretty good. In Rome, or at least they were at the time. I mean, I can't vouch for the situation now because I haven't lived in the country for several decades at this point. But they were pretty good. And so even though I went to a completely middle average high school, I really had very, very good teachers. One of my best teachers, in fact, was my philosophy teacher in the particular type of high school that I took, which is called the Scientific Lyceum, which is typically preparatory for college, you had to take 3 years of philosophy. And my teacher was just brilliant. She just made the whole thing come alive. My interest was in biology at the time, was in science in general, in biology in particular. In fact, that's what I pursued as my first academic career later on. And there too, most, although not all, my high school teachers were just excellent, particularly my physics and mathematics teachers. So, so I learned a lot and actually enjoyed. I mean, for a lot of people, especially in the United States, people tell me that their high school experience is horrible for a number of reasons. The high schools don't work very well. The teachers are not that good or interested, or they're overwhelmed by other things. The social environment is kind of strange. I had a perfectly fine, you know, sort of flying through this whole experience. Of course, I couldn't wait to get into college, because then I would study what I really loved, which was, you know, biology. But high school was, you know, growing up in Rome was a very good, very positive experience. So yeah, it wasn't that difficult to sort of nurture my interests. As I said before, my grandfather started doing that when I was a kid, you know, buying me books about whatever topic I was interested in. Very early on, I was interested in astronomy. So he bought me a small telescope when I was, you know, in elementary school still. And a crucial thing is, for some reason, he figured that I liked to write, which is pretty unusual for, you know, elementary school and early middle school kid. And so he bought me my first typewriter. And I haven't stopped since. You know, I was like going on there, you know, typing several hours every day or throughout the week. So those were very good, very positive aspects of my growing up in Rome.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say you're quite prolific in the writing, Massimo, if you agree with that. So I seen that obviously with the university, says college, the university. What was the university you attended for your biology? And I'll sort of come back to that in a second when you go.
So I went to one of the 3 universities in Rome. Actually, I think now it's 4 of them. Okay. But the big one, which is called La Sapienza, which just means wisdom. And it was, again, a very, very good experience. My teachers in biology were very good. In fact, my very first professor was Gianni D'Amato, was a botanist, and he recognized immediately that I had a particular interest in scientific research and an academic career. So at the end of my first semester, he offered me a spot in his lab to do some research or to start learning how to do basic research, and I accepted. And sure enough, 4 years later, I graduated with, you know, the Italian system essentially is combines college and what in most other countries is referred to as a master's degree. Yeah. So you had to develop a thesis, experimental thesis, which you then defend and that sort of stuff. So that was my first, you know, entry into scientific research. The thesis was published as a couple of papers, and that was sort of the beginning of my academic career at that point.
See, can I just go on that point? I've seen when I was doing a bit of research into you, was it the first PhD? Was that in genetics? Yeah.
Yeah. So after college and, you know, this combination of college and masters, then I was faced with, okay, what do we do now? And in order to pursue an academic career, and I applied in several places in Italy for a doctorate degree. Yeah. So which is a standard European style PhD. It's like 3 years, essentially only research. You know, you don't do any teaching, that sort of stuff, which is different from the American approach to the same. And I was accepted at the University of Ferrara, which is in northeastern Italy. It's between Bologna and Venice. And yes, that's where I did my first graduate degree in genetics, particularly in population and quantitative genetics. So I was doing a lot of statistical analysis of my interest has always been in plant populations and in plant ecology and evolution. So I was doing research on plants, and with a fairly large, you know, component of quantitative stuff, which served me well later, because throughout my career as a biologist, I was very much a quantitative person, and I learned some of the fundamental skills there at the University of Ferrara.
Mm-hmm. Gregor Mendel, who was he?
Sorry, say that again?
Gregor Mendel, or Mandel, yeah. Who was he?
Yeah, definitely. He was the very first geneticist of the modern era, and his brilliancy was in fact in the fact that he realized that he had to apply quantitative methods to the study of genetics, because up to that point, people had just been looking sort of for qualitatively, oh, the offspring of this cross looks like this. Mendel had this brilliant idea that, wait a minute, if we start counting things and if we start actually making, you know, at least elementary statistics, we might get somewhere. And that's how he discovered the concept of gene. Of course, genes themselves were not identified as the biological material known as DNA until 1953. But Mendel identified the fact that there are these particulate, bits of something that he didn't know that, however, are responsible for heredity. It was an interesting thing from his part, because at the time, Charles Darwin was wondering, you know, he was publishing about simultaneously, he was publishing The Origin of Species, and Darwin was wondering what the basis for heredity was. That was the major thing that was missing from his theory. And he didn't know, he was not aware of Mendel's work. And it's, you know, one can speculate what might have happened if Darwin actually had become aware of Mendel's work and the two had started, you know, collaborating or something like that. And I learned that when I heard of this story, I learned a very early lesson for my academic career. The reason Mendel's work was not particularly well known, and we had to wait until 1900 before it was rediscovered, is because it made two major mistakes from a point of view of an academic. One, he published in a small publication, a small journal that nobody was reading. And so, you know, it was ignored. And two, he went into administration. He became an administrator, basically. And that was the end of his scientific career. So I made note in my mind of, you know, try not to publish in small journals and never, ever become an administrator.
Yeah, that's good advice. I seen that your next PhD you did, obviously biology, so that was a follow-up, obviously, the geneticists and that. And where did that take you? Did that take you to America? Was that after?
Yeah, that was an interesting story. Sort of an unusual, I don't know about interesting, but certainly an unusual story. So what happened was that after my doctorate in genetics at University of Ferrara, I applied for a fellowship to do research with the National Research Council, and I was there for a couple of years. That was fine. But then at some point I decided that, you know, it's really time to broaden my horizons, and I need to go abroad, either to another European country, the UK was a possibility, the Netherlands were another possibility, Germany, or better yet, the United States, because the kind of research that I was doing, I was interested in nature-nurture issues, so the interactions between gene and environments. And the best research, you know, the most cutting-edge research was being done at the time in the United States. So I was trying to figure out a way to get there, and I met at a scientific conference this guy, Carl Schlichting, who was at the University of Connecticut. And so I applied with him for a postdoc position, so a postdoctoral position, which is what you typically do after your doctorate. And Carl was very interesting because he was very interested in what I was wanting to do. And he said, yeah, I would like you to come here, but I'm just a very recently appointed assistant professor. I don't really have money. I don't have a grant. I can't really pay a postdoc salary. And he said, however, I can offer you a PhD position as a student. And I said, well, why would I want to do that? I just got my PhD last year. Why would I want to do a second one? And Carl made a very persuasive argument. He said, well, you can come here and do whatever you want. You can do research on whatever the hell you want. You're going to be my only student for the next 2 or 3 years, probably, because, you know, it takes time for a new professor to get his career going. We can pay you more money than a regular graduate student, and we can allow you to teach less than a regular graduate student. I said, okay, fine, deal. It was one of the best decisions in my life, because by the time I defended my PhD in evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut, Carl and I had accumulated enough material that eventually got published over the years. I think we published together something like 13 papers in one book. And to give you a sort of perspective, typically with a PhD from an American university, you don't write a book. You don't get to write books. And the typical number of papers is like between 3 and 5. So we actually produced like 2.5 times more, 2 to 3 times more than it's typical. And so he was right. This was an actually very good decision. Yeah, I definitely did not regret it.
And I think which leads us on to the last PhD, and obviously the one that's probably influenced you the much that we can relate to is the one on philosophy. How did that come about?
So that also was an unusual story, because after my PhD at the University of Connecticut, I actually did go on and do an actual real postdoc at Brown University on Rhode Island, on the East Coast of the United States. And so my biology career got started. I got a position at the University of Tennessee, which is in the southeast of the United States. And I was there first as an assistant professor, then I got tenure, then I became an associate professor, a full professor. That's the standard academic sort of career. And then at that point, something interesting happened. I kind of went through a midlife crisis, both personally and academically, which is not unusual. I mean, by that time I was in sort of, well, it was a little earlier than usual, I suppose, because I was in my early 40s. But it's typical for academics actually to get through to a certain point in their career, especially after tenure, and say, okay, well, now what? I need to do something different. You know, I thought like, well, my career is going well. My research is funded at a good pace. I had graduate students, postdocs of my own. But do I really want to keep doing the same things for the next 30 years or so, or whatever it is? And the answer was very clearly no. This is not unusual. And so what happens is that people then typically start looking at neighboring fields. So I was in evolutionary biology. I might have switched to ecology, or I might have gone into molecular biology or something like that. That's what a lot of my colleagues did. In my case, that didn't seem like particularly sort of exciting enough or something. And then something interesting happened, something serendipitous happened. The University of Knoxville, of Tennessee in Knoxville, where I was, the philosophy department hired a brilliant young philosopher of science, Jonathan Kaplan. Jonathan had just defended his dissertation at Stanford, and turns out his dissertation was on philosophical aspects of the nature-nurture debate, which means that he actually had read several of my papers in a couple of my books. So when he came to campus, he looked me up, he called me and he said, hey, look, I'm here, and so I'm new, and I know your work. I'd like to just get together for coffee and have a chat. Which we did, and we hit it off very well. And immediately we became friends. We started collaborating on a series of papers. He started coming to my lab meetings and interacting with my graduate students. So things were going very, very well. And at some point I said, Jonathan, I got this crazy idea. How about, I've been looking for something different to do, expand in a different direction. So how about I go back to school, enroll in the PhD program in philosophy here at the University of Tennessee, and you be my mentor. And Jonathan looked at me, I still remember, this was over lunch. He said, how many classes in one did you have? Because he was a junior professor without tenure, and I was a senior professor with tenure. And so that was a very unusual situation. And I said, well, I don't drink at lunchtime. So it's like, I'm serious. He kind of came around the idea. We went to the dean. We asked for permission to do that, which was granted. And so for the next 3 years, the following 3 years, I was running my lab in the morning and early afternoon, at my graduate students, research, etc. And fortunately, I had a reduced teaching load because of my grants. And then in the afternoon, late afternoon, early evening, I was going across campus and taking philosophy classes. And during the weekend, I was working on my dissertation. In other words, for 3 years, I basically had no life as a result of that, outside of what I was doing there on campus. But it worked out very nicely. So I did defend my thesis, which became a book. It's called Making Sense of Evolution, published by the University of Chicago Press. And it was a book on philosophical analysis of the current state of evolutionary theory, essentially, and where evolutionary biology stands as a field. So that was fun, but the intention was not to move full-time to philosophy. The intention was just to keep going my lab, and then on the side, write philosophy books. But what happened a few years later, as part of my personal life crisis, I moved to New York because I was getting a little sick and tired of small town America. And, I happened to be working at the University of, the State University of New York at Stony Brook, which is on Long Island. And it's sort of in a suburban area, but it's only 40 miles from New York City. So I figured, okay, I have to move. But once I moved, I also had to find a job. And so I thought, okay, let's find out. I'm going to apply to whatever jobs are available at a senior level. If it's biology, it's going to be biology. If it's philosophy, it's going to be philosophy. Turns out the first job that was available was at the City University of New York in philosophy. I applied. They got me, and so there it is. And now I'm a philosopher full time. I've been a philosopher full time for the last 12, 13 years.
That's excellent. Before I get into the introduction of how you get into Stoicism, I just want a quick question. I was looking through your range of books, and I've heard your discussions on it before, but can you tell us what is pseudoscience, right? And why is it a problem? Before I move on to Stoicism.
Yeah, so when I still was in biology, I became interested in the problem in what philosophers call the demarcation problem, the distinction between science and pseudoscience. And the reason was very practical. As I mentioned, I was at the University of Tennessee. Now, Tennessee is in what Americans call the Bible Belt. So it's full of creationists. And here I was as an evolutionary biologist, and my class was probably like 80 or 90% creationists, right? And so I run immediately into these kind of standard objections that creation is raised to evolutionary theory. And I consider creationism, of course, a pseudoscience. It's not like it has no basis in reality, but it's very popular in certain areas of the United States. And so I got interested in organizing public events. Something is called Darwin Day, which has become actually popular. I was one of the very early organizers of Darwin Day in Tennessee, and then throughout the United States. Now it's become an international event. Usually it's on Darwin's birthday in February. And the reason was, let's start teaching people about the nature of science, the difference between science and pseudoscience, that sort of stuff. When I made the transition to philosophy, and particularly philosophy of science, which is in the business of understanding how science works, and when it fails, how science doesn't work. Well, one of the problems in philosophy of science is the demarcation problem. And I saw, I thought, well, that's interesting. I've been interested in pseudoscience for a while, so now I can actually work on this as a sort of full-time thing. As a result, I published 2 books. One is for the general public. It's called Nonsense on Stilts, which is a general examination of pseudoscience and why it matters to the public, to everyday discourse. I mean, we're seeing examples right now. People who refuse to vaccinate themselves, for instance, because they believe in the pseudoscientific notion that vaccines cause autism, or people who reject, the notion of social distancing and wearing masks during a pandemic because they think that it's a government conspiracy. That's another aspect of pseudoscience. So, pseudoscience actually does have negative consequences at an individual and societal level. So I thought that this was not only an interesting area to develop as a scholar, but also it has actually practical applications. The second book I co-edited with my friend and colleague Martin Boudry, who is at the University of Ghent in Belgium, and it's called The Philosophy of Pseudoscience. And it kind of helped establish that actually as an independent field of scholarship within philosophy. Philosophers have been interested in pseudoscience before, but the notion that one can actually do serious research, sustained research, scholarship on it was kind of new, and it was kind of interesting to get that one out.
Yes, that's really interesting, Massimo. Can you tell us how you get your introduction to Stoicism, and tell us a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the midlife crisis part. So we talked about the academic aspect of it, but there was also a personal one. Again, nothing particularly surprising or unusual, but there was a particular year where I got kind of multiple hits in terms of sort of personal situation. My father died, which it happens, but it's always a fairly major event. My wife at the time divorced me, and I got a new job and moved to a different city. Now, any psychologist would tell you that one of those 4 things is enough to cause stress. 4 of them simultaneously, like literally in the span of 3 or 4 months, that's a lot. So I thought, okay, well, how do I deal with this situation, with these kind of situations? And I was studying, I just finished my PhD in philosophy. So I said, okay, well, if an answer is going to come to this kind of life-changing situation, that's got to be from philosophy. You know, where else? And as a result, I started sort of deliberately looking into philosophies of what I call philosophies of life, which of course Stoicism is one example. And now, backtracking for a minute, when I was growing up in Italy, of course I was in Rome, so my family was Catholic, and so I grew up Catholic, although very mildly so. I mean, we were going on to church only in Christmas and Easter, you know, that sort of stuff. But still, it was Catholic. You know, I went to catechism, I learned the basic stuff. By the time I got into high school, I rejected that notion because my priest was simply not able to give me decent answers, comprehensible answers to basic questions. Like, for instance, I still remember that I asked him about transubstantiation. So this notion that when you take communion, you not metaphorically, but literally, you're eating the flesh of Jesus and drinking the blood of Jesus. And I said, how does that work? Because it feels to me like wine and bread. So try to explain this to me, or give me some kind of, intelligible explanation of the notion of the fact that God is one and three. Mm-hmm. It's like, that seems to be like a basic contradiction. Remember, I took basic philosophy in high school. So I said, that seems like a basic contradiction of the laws of logic. Something cannot be both one and three. And so what the hell is going on there? Because my priest was not giving me any reasonable answers, so I said, okay, that's it, I'm out. And ever since, I consider myself a secular humanist. Because secular humanism was like, okay, this kind of makes sense. I subscribe to the general notions. Essentially, you can think of secular humanism as a philosophy that supports what then became the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, right? So all of that stuff I'm in agreement with. But it turns out, when the personal life crisis came, secular humanism was completely useless. It was not giving me any practical advice on what to do with my life. Yes, I'm in favor of human rights. I'm in favor of, universal education and healthcare and all that. But that doesn't help me as a person try to figure out how to live through a year where all of these other things have been happening to me, right? That's why I purposefully said, okay, let's sit down and take a systematic look at what else is available out there. There must be some philosophy of life that is available. My first stop was Buddhism, because a good number of friends had told me, you might want to look into Buddhist philosophy as from that perspective. It's really very useful in terms of personal ethics and so on, which it is to a lot of people. But it didn't really click with me for a number of reasons. One of which was that the language was alien to me, obviously, because I didn't grow up in India, China, or Japan. And so the kind of language was too mystical from my perspective. It's like a little too metaphorical. I respect people that for whom it works, but it didn't work for me. And also, of course, there was a problem with the metaphysics. I mean, karma, reincarnation, and all that sort of stuff. No, I'm an atheist. I believe that we die, and then we die, you're done. So there's no such thing as karma, reincarnation, something like that. So I said, okay, well, that was interesting, but not going to work. Then I quickly realized that the answer was going to come from what philosophers refer to as virtue ethics, right? So virtue ethics, because virtue ethics, which originated in ancient Greece and Rome, because virtue ethics is about developing your own character, giving you guidance, specific guidance, particular guidance about how to live your life. So it's like, okay, that sounds interesting. And of course, when you start doing, looking into virtue ethics, the first stop is Aristotle, because he wrote the book. The Nicomachean Ethics is essentially the book about virtue ethics. But that didn't do it. First of all, it's too theoretical. Aristotle has nothing at all about how to actually live your life. It tells you a bunch of interesting things from a theoretical perspective, but apparently it wasn't that interested in the practice, for one thing. But also, Aristotelian virtue ethics is fairly aristocratic, right? So for Aristotle, virtue, meaning excellence of character and things like that, is important. It's crucial. It's fundamental. You cannot live a good life. You cannot live a eudaimonic life, as the Greeks referred to it, without virtue. However, he also was very clear that you cannot flourish in life, you cannot have a eudaimonic life unless you have some externals, particularly a little bit of education, a little bit of wealth, and even a little bit of good looks. And I said, okay, then I'm screwed. That's it. That's not gonna happen. It just felt too aristocratic for being, which is not surprising because Aristotle was from an aristocratic Macedonian family. You know, his father was the personal physician to the king of Macedon. So, you know, aristocracy makes sense. Well, then after that, the next stop was Epicurus. Part of the reason, a major part of the reason for that is because secular humanists themselves often are into Epicureanism, and they are into Epicureanism for good reasons. Mostly two reasons. The metaphysics works fairly well, right? The Epicureans were atomists, so they were materialists. They thought that the world is just made of atoms bumping into each other. That goes well with a secular humanist perspective. And in terms of ethics, there was a lot of, Epicurus put a lot of emphasis on friendship. And I said, oh, that sounds good. That's really interesting. So I started looking more in detail in Epicurus, and then I hit the wall. I hit the problem, which is the major goal of an Epicurean life is to live without pain, especially not just physical, but especially mental pain. And Epicurus was very clear that one of the major things you can do to avoid pain or to minimize pain in life is to get the hell out of any social and political involvement, right? You know, be in your little garden with your friends, but forget politics and society. And I said, nah, that's not going to work. That's not, I don't think that a meaningful human life actually should, I really think you should include sort of some kind of, you know, political and social involvement. So that was out. So that's where I was. And then one day I saw this thing of all places on my Twitter feed that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I looked at it and I said, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? And then I thought about it, wait a minute, Stoicism, that's also a kind of virtue ethics. Stoicism, that's Marcus Aurelius. I read Marcus in Meditations in college. I thought it was an interesting book. Stoicism, that's Seneca. So wait a minute, when I was in high school, I took Latin and actually translated Seneca. But I never put the two together. I never actually even thought that Seneca and Marcus Aurelius actually were talking about the same kind of stuff. And Epictetus, what the hell is Epictetus? Why did I go through an entire program in, you know, PhD program in philosophy, and even took courses in ancient philosophy and never heard of Epictetus? Like, how is this even possible? So I signed up for Stoic Week, and sure enough, you know, like the first or second day, one of the readings was from Epictetus. And as soon as I read that, it's like, it really clicked. It's like, holy crap, this guy, where have you been for my whole life? Because this guy really spoke to me, plain language, good sense of humor, very, very practical in terms of applications. And so by the end of Stoic Week, I actually contacted some of the organizers, particularly, you know, Don Robertson and I think Chris Gill at the time. And I said, look, guys, I'm a professional philosopher. I started doing this thing. This is interesting. What would you suggest if I were to commit to do this for another couple of months? Because as you know, usually Stoic Week is like in the fall, so October, November. That year was in early November. So I said, I want to try to do it, trying through the end of the year. And they were very kind that, you know, they responded and said, well, you can start here and so on. So I did. I committed for another couple of months. Then at the end of the year, I said, this is really great. This is really making a difference. My friends were and family were telling me that I was much more calm and much more focused about things. It's like, okay, I'm going to commit for yet another year. And then here we are now, several years later, and we're still talking about it.
Oh, it's excellent. I have a very similar experience to that, actually. Can you, I've always had a stumbling block with this, right? Living in accord with nature. Please define or explain.
Yeah.
It's always something I've come up against, I've struggled with, so can you please explain?
Yeah, that's always a stumbling block, right? Because, so I think sometimes I had this sneaky suspicion that the Stoics did this on purpose. They came up with a bunch of these petty phrases like live according to nature.
Yeah.
That could easily go on a bumper sticker, right? It's like you can put it on your car. And I think they did it on purpose because that clearly, the message is not clear. It's like, well, what does that mean? And I think they did it as a conversation starter. It's like, well, somebody will go and say, what does that mean? It's like, well, let me tell you. And then we'll give them a lecture, you know, an hour long. I don't know if this is true, but I'd like to think of Zeno, you know, going around Athens, thinking on the, you know, acting in all those lines. So living according to nature is a fundamental pillar of Stoic philosophy. And it's there from the beginning. Zeno was the first one to put the phrase in writing in his in one of his books, which unfortunately are lost, but we do have some fragments from Diogenes Laertius. Both Cleanthes and Chrysippus, the second and third head of the Stoa, use the phrase. Seneca uses it several times. Marcus Aurelius uses it several times. Epictetus not so much, but it's been there basically from the beginning throughout the history of Stoicism. And there are two major interpretations of this. So actually, first of all, we should talk about what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that you should be running naked into the middle of the woods and hug trees. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not what it's about. More importantly, and this is actually something that people often get wrong about Stoicism, especially from the outside. It's not an appeal to nature. It's not to say that everything that is natural is therefore good. Okay? Because if that were the case, I mean, the Stoics are very clear that that is not what they mean. Because there are all sorts of things that are natural to human beings, and yet they're not good. For instance, getting angry at certain situations is natural, but the Stoics are very obviously clear, particularly Seneca, that that is not a good thing. So they clearly don't mean that things that are natural are therefore good. And it's a good thing that they don't mean that, because that's a basic logical fallacy called the appeal to nature. And they were, especially Chrysippus, were very good logicians. So you'd be surprised if they would commit a fundamental logical fallacy and put it right at the basics of their philosophy. What do they mean then? Well, they mean a couple of things, and actually there was a disagreement between Cleanthes and Chrysippus about this. It means live life in accordance with universal nature, but also live life in accordance with human nature. Now, if you allow me for a few minutes, because this is a really important concept, and so many people get it wrong. I mean, there are two different ways to cash this out. One is the ancient version, and the other one is the modern version that people like Lawrence Baker and myself are being putting forth. And I think there is a significant difference between the two versions. So the ancients thought that living according to cosmic nature made perfect sense, because they were pantheists. They believed that the universe was the same thing as God, and the universe God was capable of, it was a living organism capable of reason, the famous logos, right? So basically what they thought was that whatever happens in the universe, including whatever happens to us, is for the good. Not in the Christian sense, because the Christians think that whatever happens is part of God's plan, and God loves and cares about each one of us individually. The Stoics didn't think that at all. What happens for the universe is good for the universe, but that doesn't mean that it's good for you specifically. In fact, Epictetus is very clear about this. When he uses a famous metaphor, he says, imagine you're a foot that is about to step in the mud, right? That's unpleasant. As a foot, you don't want to step in the mud. But because you know that you're connected to our organism, and the body has to cross the path, and the path happens to be muddy, then you do it gladly. You don't do it gladly because it's good for you. It's not. But it is good for the body. And so it makes sense for you to actually do it. That's the way the Stoics thought about the connection between human nature and universal nature. Whatever happens to us, we should be not only accept it, fate. You don't only accept fate, you actually embrace it. You actually love your fate, as the famous phrase, which came out after much later by Nietzsche, Amor Fati, puts it, right? Why? Well, because we're part of these universal organisms. So whatever we do, it's good for the cosmos. And what else could you ask about your life other than doing something that's good for the cosmos? The problem, of course, is that most of us modern Stoics are not pantheists. And as a scientist, I cannot wrap my mind around the notion of the universe conceived as a living organism. The universe is not a living organism. There are living organisms within the universe, obviously, but the universe itself is just a set of dynamic processes that are regulated by what we call laws of nature. So I can't go in the direction in which the ancient Stoics were going, but I still can retain the notion of living according to universal and human nature, except that it now means something a little bit different. In terms of in terms of cosmic nature, Lawrence Baker, the author of A New Stoicism, actually put it best. he says essentially for a modern Stoic, what that means is to pay attention to the universe as it is and act accordingly, as opposed to engaging in wishful thinking about how the universe should work, right? So the way he puts it very simply is like, follow the facts, particularly the scientific facts about the universe. You have to, as a Stoic, you have to accept factual knowledge, scientific knowledge about the universe. The universe doesn't work in the way we would like it to work. It just is the way it is. And it is imperative that you both understand and live accordingly, meaning that you live respecting the constraints that the universe, the laws of physics, laws of biology, etc., put on you. In terms of human nature, in modern terms, of course, we do talk about human nature, but human nature is not, as the ancients thought, some kind of outgrowth of the universal nature. What it is, we are we're social animals that evolved on a particular planet at a particular point in time. However, the two fundamental aspects that the Stoics thought, the ancient Stoics thought, separate us from every other living organism on Earth still hold, even according to modern science, to modern molecular biology, modern evolutionary biology. And those are two things. We're highly social and we're capable of reason, right? Those are the two things that actually the ancient Stoics really latched on to, especially Seneca and Marcus Aurelius later on, to essentially put forth the notion that a life lived according to nature means a life in which you use reason to improve social living, to improve the human cosmopolis, right? And that one, as a modern Stoic, I can be completely on board with, because it's in agreement with a modern scientific outlook on things. It is true that human beings are the most social, most complex social animals on planet Earth. And it is also true that we're by far the ones that are more capable of engaging in rational thinking, and especially in rational discourse. Other animals do things that kind of resemble. There are other social animals, obviously, social insects for sure, but especially other social primates. And some other animals do engage in, it seems like they engage in some basic level of rational thinking, but nothing compared to what human beings can do. Right. I mean, there's no animal that would be having this conversation at this point, talking about philosophy of life and how to live your life and that sort of stuff. We can, and so it is incumbent on us to actually do it and follow through.
That's brilliant, Massimo. Thanks for that. I see that the time's catching up with a wee bit, so I'll maybe bypass a question or two. But can you describe the relationship with the cardinal virtues, and what do you find the hardest one to adhere to? And can you give
Sorry,
I
missed part of what you said, so do you mind repeating?
Could you give us a brief description of what the cardinal virtues are in Stoicism, and what one do you find the hardest to adhere to?
Oh, that's a good question. So one of the things that I've been asked very often during interviews about my books is, what isn't Stoicism a really hard philosophy to practice in general? And I'm going to get to some of the practices, specific practices, in a minute, but in general. And I said, well, no more than Buddhism or Christianity or Confucianism. I mean, if you really want to be a good Buddhist, a serious Buddhist, or a serious Christian, that's pretty hard, because they require a lot of you. Now, of course, you can be a sort of a superficial level involvement with these philosophy, in which that's the case also for Stoicism. But if you want to practice in seriously, that is in fact demanding. After all, we're talking about literally a philosophy of life. We're talking about something that applies literally everything you do throughout your life every day. So yeah, it is demanding. It should be demanding. I mean, that's, Now, in terms of exercises, as you know, with my friend Greg Lopez, we wrote this book, a handbook for new Stoics. Actually, in the UK, I think it's published as Living Like a Stoic or something like that. I don't know why they changed the title, but just to make it more confusing. And we propose 52 of those exercises. The way we do it, we organize it according to the 3 disciplines of Epictetus. So one set of exercises concerns desire and aversion, a second set concerns action, and a third set concerns assent. All of those exercises are based on quotations from the original texts, mostly Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, of course, but also Musonius Rufus, Hierocles, some of the so-called minor Stoics, minor only because we don't have a lot of their writings, unfortunately, that survived. And the exercises vary in difficulty. And I think, however, the difficulty varies from person to person. I mean, there are some exercises that are more difficult for specific individuals and less so for other individuals. We set up a Facebook page of kind of to support people that actually go through the book or through parts of the book and want to practice the exercises. And we occasionally we do run into somebody who says, "Wait, this was really difficult." Yeah. And so we try to help out. I don't know. I have my favorite ones, and some of my favorite ones are fairly difficult to do consistently. They're not difficult in a sort of conceptual fashion. They're all pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, right, in terms of what to do. They're difficult, however, to implement. Like, for instance, one of my favorite is try to go for an entire week without ever using the words good or bad or their synonyms applied to anything other than virtue or character, right? It's really difficult because you slip up constantly. You say, "Oh, I had a really good meal last night." No, you didn't. You had a nutritious meal that was, stimulating and so on and so forth, but not good. Oh, I saw a really bad movie. No, you didn't. You saw a movie that was not well done from a cinematographical perspective, that the script was not, as it should be, but not bad, because that doesn't apply. Those are all preferred or dispreferred indifference. So it sounds like a silly exercise, by the way, but it actually is, in fact, one of the most interesting ones, because, of course, the point is to drive home this clear distinction that the Stoics make between virtue as the only true intrinsic good and everything else that can be selected or not, preferred or not, because it does have value, but it's not as important as virtue because it doesn't affect your character, right? It doesn't, and so even Stoic practitioners very often slip up into sort of a more Aristotelian way of looking at things, where they value externals a bit too much. And this is not a new thing. Epictetus in the Discourses complains about some of his students. He says, you guys play and being Stoics here in my classroom, and then you go out there and I see you being Aristotelians. And so it's like, so what gives there? you're not serious enough about this stuff. So that's one of my favorite exercises. One of the most difficult for a lot of people, because we live in the consumerist society, is an exercise that it's actually inspired by Socrates. Diogenes Laertius says that Socrates used to go through the agora, through the Athenian market, which was, of course, plenty of goods to buy, and he didn't buy anything, and he would get on the other side and would say, "Wow, there are so many things that I don't need," right? And so the exercise, as Greg and I propose it, is try to go for an entire week without buying anything other than basic food necessities. Right? Just the basic stuff. You want to eat for sure, but don't buy anything, or either online or offline, for a week. Not forever, just for a week. Turns out it's really difficult because we live, especially in the United States, we live in a society that is highly consumerist, where, when I moved to the United States first in the 1990s, I paid attention to what, in my mind, in my experience, were some of the major differences between what I would call a typical European culture and the American culture. And one of the things that was different was I never heard before the phrase retail therapy. This notion that if you feel bad, here's a simple way to feel good. Just go to the mall and buy something. It's like, really? What the hell? I mean, I take it that this is good for the companies that they're selling you goods, for sure, but seriously? And yes, Americans are very serious about retail therapy. It's a thing. And so that exercise that I just described is one of those things that clearly counters retail therapy. It also counters something else. Modern psychologists have been able to describe this thing that it's called the hedonic treadmill. They discovered that basically what happens when you buy stuff, when you do retail therapy, is that we get used to the new things very quickly, and then you crave something else, which again works very well for the companies that want to sell you the stuff, right? So you buy a new iPhone, let's say, you're all excited for a few days, like, oh, I got my new iPhone. And then, a week later or 2 weeks later, now it's just my phone. Now I need something else to get me excited, right? And then that also becomes, an ordinary object. So I need something else. So that's why it's called the hedonic treadmill, right? It's about pleasure, hedonism, and it's a treadmill. You keep going on it, and you're not going anywhere. You're not getting anywhere. Well, one way that even modern psychologists suggest to reset the hedonic treadmill is to occasionally do without things, right? And so a classic type of Stoic exercises, which you find in Seneca very clearly, is the self-deprivation exercises, right? So for a week, don't buy anything, or fast for a day or two, or abstain from drinking alcohol for a day or two. Whatever it is that works for you, or that you need to work on. If you're too prone to buy stuff, then use the don't buy anything for a week exercise. If you tend to be a little bit too intemperate at the dinner table, then go fasting a day or two a week, that sort of stuff. And so there is very good empirical evidence from modern psychology that these things actually do work.
That's really interesting, Massimo. I want to ask you maybe one last question before we kind of wrap up. I know Jerry's on tonight, so it's more kind of related to Jerry. He's kind of relatively new to Stoicism. So what would you suggest for some like kind of new source material? I know you've got a lot of stuff yourself. Donald Robertson's got a lot of stuff, but maybe some other stuff like the ancients or so forth. You can give some advice on to start him in his reading. I know he's already stuff.
Yeah, so that's a good question about what should one read and what should one go about in terms of sort of learning more and practice in Stoicism. The first thing is we need to remember Stoicism is mostly a practice, right? So you don't actually need to learn. I mean, I'm saying this against my own interest because I've written 3 books. The next one actually is coming out in September, and so it's against my own interest. But Stoicism is mostly practice. So you really don't need to read a lot. That said, if you are into a philosophy of life, you naturally want to know more about it. You naturally want to go both to the original sources and to the modern incarnations of this stuff, right? And so I would say, I keep changing my mind about this, about what sort of to suggest to people. But I would say, in terms of ancient sources, start with 3. Seneca's letters to Lucilius, particularly the University of Chicago Press translation that came out a few years ago, which is excellent. Epictetus' Discourses. Don't start with the Enchiridion, because the Enchiridion is more difficult. The Enchiridion is very short, so a lot of people start with the Enchiridion because, oh, it's short, I can read this thing very quickly. I know, but it kind of assumes that you have a lot of background before you actually start reading it, so don't. Go with the Discourses. The best modern translation of the Discourses is Robin Hart for Oxford University Press. And then, of course, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Again, there are a number of good translations. I think the best one available out there is Robin Hart, same person. Also, again, the Oxford Classics version. So I would say those 3. There's a lot of other stuff that one can read, right? But those 3 are really ought to be present in any Stoic practitioner's bookshelf, and you should go. And they don't necessarily need to be read cover to cover. They're actually meant to be read. None of those 3. They're not systematic expositions of Stoicism. You can actually open them at pretty much any point, just like you would. I mean, sorry, forgive me for the analogy, but just like you would do for the Gospels. If you're a Christian, right? You just open it at random. You don't read them cover to cover. You read them. You open it up and say, "Oh, what does that say? And how does that relate to my life? How does that? What does Epictetus mean here? And what can that tell me about how to live my own life?" So that's in terms of ancient sources. In terms of modern stuff, a few years ago there was very little out there, but now there is kind of an embarrassment of riches. And so I would say certainly at least one of the books by Don Robertson. I mean, his most recent one of course, is How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, but I still think that one of his early ones on of course, now the title escapes me, but it came out a number of years ago, and it's about the how to live a good life. It's actually a very, very good one. It's got a very practical sort of approach because he's a cognitive behavioral therapist, and so he has this very practical approach in mind. John Sellers, I think, is one of the authors that really ought to be in any on any bookshelf, from a modern Stoic perspective. I would say particularly is Stoicism. It's just called Stoicism. That came out a few years ago. It does have a new one that is very recent, and it's very short and to the point, and so that's fine. But I think Stoicism is actually one of his best. And another one that he published called The Art of Living, which is meant for a little bit more of an academic audience, but it's actually very easy to read. It's a very easy read for the general public, and it really gives you this notion of Stoicism as the art of living. So I would say those are definitely the top of my list.
Brilliant, Massimo. Massimo, can I just ask a quick question? Can you hold off for a few more minutes to see if anybody would come in with a question?
Yeah.
Is it anybody want to come in with a question for Massimo? Colin, do you like to unmute yourself, mate? Thanks.
It's just about your Stoa Nova, Massimo, and the great courses stuff that you've recently submitted. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And do you think there's a place for a modern Stoic school?
Yes, that's interesting. That's an interesting question. So, to some extent, we do have modern Stoic schools, right? Not officially. I mean, not anything that you can sort of go and get your diploma. But we do have kind of unofficial schools. I mean, the whole modern Stoicism group, for all effective purposes, functions as a modern Stoic school with a number of teachers, like including Don Robertson and Greg Sadler and a number of people. I started out this thing called the Stoa Nova a few years ago, which essentially it's a web page with a bunch of resources, but you can go there. And now the Stoa Nova, which is just me, it's not like there's nobody else working on it, but it now offers online courses, a number of other resources that are available for people, books, of course, and stuff like that. So to some extent, we do have and then we have a number of local Stoas, right? There's something called the Stoic Fellowship, which was actually started by my friend Greg Lopez and a couple other people. And that one is an organization that tracks local groups and helps local groups get started, provides materials and stuff like that. And to some extent, that's really the ancient model, isn't it? That is, you have either individual teachers like Epictetus, or a location like the Stoa in Athens, where multiple people go and interact. And I think that model works very well also in a modern context, as opposed to a more rigid structure, right? I wouldn't favor really necessarily sort of starting in any kind of official Stoic school, because the very word official seems constraining and seems like a little, well, who's the Pope of Stoicism here? Who gets to decide what we teach and what we don't? Of course, there is one major difference between the way in which modern Stoas work and as distinct to the ancient one, and that's the online presence. Right? I mean, we couldn't be doing this if we were not for the ability to do videos in live video. The social media help from that perspective. As we all know, social media have a mixed bag kind of thing. You find all sorts of crap, unfortunately, out there. But if you're discerning, you also find a lot of good stuff. I mean, the Facebook group that Don Robertson organizes, and facilitates. I think the last time I checked, it was over 70,000 people, and he's incredible.
A lot, 79,000, I'm sure.
And he's incredibly active on that. I don't know how he finds the time to do that sort of stuff, but there are a number of other groups. I have a much smaller one, which is also on Facebook, which is a private group, meaning that you can search for it, but then if you want to join it, it's actually private, so other people from the outside cannot look at what people post. And the reason for that, it's on purpose, because I like to keep the discussion smaller, to a smaller group of people. It's more conducive to open, frank discussions about issues and stuff like that, rather than an open forum. But they both of those things actually serve a function. So in terms of Stoic schools, I think we're doing pretty well from that perspective. I really support the Stoic Fellowship initiative, particularly because that's the notion. It's like a capillary action on the ground. Everybody then can do it. We provide the resources for people to do it, but then everybody can do it as they prefer. And if it doesn't work for them with a particular group, they can go on and start another one. It's fine.
Thanks, Massimo. Jerry or Brian, would you like to give Massimo a quick question? Yeah, on you go, Jerry. Just unmute yourself.
Massimo, you mentioned having a online group that goes through the manual that you've written. And I got the book and I'm starting it, but I was wondering which group that was.
So it's a Facebook group, but again, it's another closed book group. So you can find, if you search with the title of the book, actually the American title, Handbook for New Stoics.
Okay.
On Facebook, you should find us. And if you don't, just feel free to send me an email and I'll give you the direct URL. And that one was started right when the book was published by Greg and I, and it's been going on now for about a year and a half. We actually went through the entire 52-week cycle. And now what it is new people coming on either look at discussion. You can search the group and find discussions pertinent to any particular week, or you can just post your question, and then either I or Greg or somebody else who's gone through the thing would actually help you out and respond to. It's like, okay, this. Yeah, I also found that problem, or here's how I did it. That sort of stuff. So it's become now a more general discussion group, but it's not meant to be a general Stoicism discussion group. It's really focused on the exercises.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Jerry. Brian, you're last. Do you want to ask Massimo a question?
No questions. I'd just like to thank you all for this event. On a strange note, I'm very surprised at the low number of attendees. It was advertised widely. The only
well,
is
sorry, go
at
ahead.
this moment in time, for the past half an hour, the group you just mentioned on the handbook is actually ongoing right now, has been for half an hour. So maybe people
That's
are in there. I'm recording it, so.
We had competition. That's right. Yes.
But it was great. It was great. Thanks very much.
No, it was fun. And, as of course, as the Stoics would say, what is up to us is to put forth these kind of things, organize them, and get together. What is not up to us is who's going to show up.
Yeah, we've got it recorded, Massimo, so I'm sure we can put it out for other people to see at a future time. Can I just ask one last quick question before you go?
Sure.
Can you tell everybody where to find you and what kind of work you've got?
Yeah, so the major places, the two
Coming up
major
and
places to find. Sorry, you kind of I lost it there for a second because of the connection. But the major two places where you can find me are there's a website called MassimoPigliucci.com. Just one word, Massimo Pigliucci, and there you basically find everything that I do, all my links to all my essays, papers, books, podcasts, you name it. The whole shebang is there. So, and it's not only about Stoicism. There's a section about biology and there's a section about philosophy, general philosophy, but most of it, actually more than half of it, is about Stoicism. So it's something to check out. And then on Twitter is my major social medium is Twitter, and I am at mpigliucci, MPIGLIUCCI.
Thanks a lot, Massimo. It's been an honour having you on. Hopefully we can get you on again in the future. Brilliant stuff,
Sounds
mate.
good.
Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
have a good one,
Everybody
guys.
have a nice night. Great stuff. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.